So you have an extra? So the Civil War and Reconstruction are major tipping points in American history and in African American history. Civil War and Reconstruction are going to be major tipping points in American and African American history, a moment where things change, never to be the same again. Civil War is still the bloodiest war in American history. 620,000 Americans are going to die in that conflict. Think about that number. That's a big number for American wars especially. Right? Vietnam is a very controversial war in American history. You have about 58,000 Americans get killed. This is 12 times that. This is 100 years earlier, so the impact, you could argue, is even bigger. 620,000 folks. Normally when America finds itself involved in foreign wars, they're abroad, right? They're in Europe or somewhere else. Usually you fight and things get destroyed abroad. You don't necessarily have to worry about cleaning it up. The Civil War occurs here. Right? The South is going to be largely destroyed as a result of the Civil War. It has to be reconstructed. Very literally has to be reconstructed or rebuilt. Right? You had General Sherman, for example, that is burning his way to the ocean to try to undermine the Southern war effort, literally destroying crops, burning down buildings, right? Taking all the animals. That's going to have to be reconstructed after the war finally ends. So we'll think about the sort of destruction involved in that. I want to use this outline really quickly. I'm going to tell you what I was kind of thinking. This is basically an overview of this period of Reconstruction. We can talk more specifically about Chapter 11. A lot of this comes from Chapter 11, but I really want you to think about the big picture in terms of what Reconstruction means, what people are experiencing, what they're feeling, what they're afraid of, what they're thinking. African Americans, as well as all Americans, are going through tremendous changes during Reconstruction, coming out of this very destructive war. Right? I'm going to explain the dates really quickly, though, on the handout. It says Reconstruction period. It says 1863 to 1877. You may see different dates for Reconstruction. Even in the textbook, you might see some different dates. Some people say Reconstruction begins in 1865, when the Civil War ends. The Civil War ends 1865, and Reconstruction is going to begin. I put the date as 1863. Anybody have any idea why? What happens in 1863, particularly in terms of African American history? That might be important enough to start the date there. What happens in 1863, January 1st in particular? It has something to do with Abraham Lincoln. Anybody know? Not yet. He's going to get shot 2 years later. Good guess, though. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln institutes the Emancipation Proclamation. It's supposed to go into effect January 1st, 1863. We can talk about that for a minute. That's why I put 1863 here as the beginning of Reconstruction, thinking about what the country's going to look like moving forward. He says basically in this Emancipation Proclamation, we're at war. The Civil War goes from 1861 to 1865. So about halfway through the war, Lincoln says, I need to do something to win this war. And he makes this dramatic statement. The statement says this: all slaves will be freed. Nope, let me correct that. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say all slaves will be free. He says all slaves in the states currently in rebellion, will be free. So we need to understand what's happening in 1863. You have the Union in the North, you have the Confederacy in the South, and you had a group of other states that didn't really join either side. They're kind of sitting it out. They're kind of waiting and seeing what happens. Some of those states have slaves. Some of those border states that didn't join the Confederacy have slaves. Lincoln doesn't say anything about those states. He only says the states in rebellion, states that have left and are now shooting at Union troops, those slaves are going to be freed. But think about what he's done. Think about this using the concept of imagined community. You have two separate imagined communities at this point. The Union of the North, right? Lincoln is the president of that country, the Union. The Confederacy has elected its own president, vice president, all of that. They have said, we're our own country now. We don't want to be a part of your country anymore. Lincoln says, I'm freeing all your slaves. Technically, that doesn't make any sense, right? That would be like Obama saying, I'm going to raise the minimum wage in Canada to $300 an hour. First of all, I'll move to Canada. But he can't do that, right? He's not the president of Canada. He doesn't have the power to make laws over another country. That's essentially what Lincoln did. Why? My question to you is why? Why does he free the slaves only in the states in rebellion? Any guesses? Why does he just free the folks in the states in rebellion, in the Confederacy, and not in the areas where he actually had power to do so? Okay, it makes sense, right? If he's going to free the slaves in the rebellion, those slaves are going to hear about it. He knew that they were going to hear about it, and they were going to take action. And this is exactly what happens. You have thousands of slaves run away, stop working, stop picking all that cotton that was making the South wealthy, stop supporting the Southern war effort, digging dishes and stuff, and run away. Many slaves actually follow Union troops once they come to southern areas and follow them out, call them contraband, if you hear that in the textbook. And this hurts the Southern war effort. It hurts the South's economy. Some of them fight their masters. Like, I'm leaving. If you try to stop me, we're going to have a problem here. But that only partially answers it, though. He could have freed the ones in the border states, too. But he's very afraid to do so. Remember, these border states are kind of sitting there watching. They haven't joined the Confederacy yet. The fear was if he freed those slaves in the border states, that they would get angry and join the Confederacy. Right? So he doesn't want to offend those states. So it isn't just about ending slavery. It was about winning the war. So it's interesting. This Emancipation Proclamation is pretty important in American history and African American history, but not maybe in the way that we think. He doesn't end slavery completely with this. It really technically has no power, but it does start a chain of events, especially when many African Americans hear about it, and then will free themselves. Slavery is not going to end until the 13th Amendment in 1865 with the end of the war. But it's still important, and that's why I have 1863 here as the opening date, even though you may see other dates like 1865. 1877 is listed as the ending date. That's because that is the year when the last Union troop is going to be removed from the South. Union troops are going to be put in the South to occupy the South after the Union wins the war, to kind of make Reconstruction happen. Right? But they're going to be pulled in 1877, and that's when stuff really started to get crazy. That's kind of the end of Reconstruction, as we'll see here. So those are the dates. Those are the dates. Civil War is 1861 to 65. I want you to look really quickly at the summary here. It's only a couple sentences, but this kind of gives you a sense of how I want you to think about this period. Right? Generally, what's important, the big picture. It says the period of Reconstruction was extremely significant in terms of the political, economic, and social transformation of the U.S. Right, so it's political, economic, and social changes that are going to happen as this country puts itself back together. Although momentous changes were occurring in these and other areas during these years, it may be most useful to consider the psychological trauma that Americans of various colors experienced as they sought to reconstruct their lives, as well as their particular responses to such trauma. So I'm saying this is going to be a traumatic period for black and white. Obviously, we're most interested in African Americans, but everybody is sort of figuring out what this country is going to look like moving forward. And they don't know what this country is going to look like as it reconstructs itself. And we'll trace that here with a couple of examples. I'm not going to read through all this. I'll kind of show you what I was thinking with this outline. Much of this is taken directly from the chapter. Letter A, Reconstruction, changes in North and South. There are two ways I want you basically to think about this Reconstruction period. A literal Reconstruction, like we said, after the war, after 4 years of war and destruction, the country has to rebuild itself. You have to rebuild buildings and schools and replant crops and wells and poisoned. All this kind of stuff has to be rebuilt. So literally, the country is rebuilding itself. You have two imagined communities that have to become one imagined community and figure out how that's going to look. But just as important might be this metaphorical reconstruction, or the psychological reconstruction. Folks figuring out, what is this country going to look like now? We have more than 200 years of racial slavery that's over. You had 4 years of having two separate countries. They literally have to come back together and kind of wrap their minds around, what is this going to look like moving forward? What are you going to do with these 4 million freed slaves? They were property yesterday. Now they're people. They want jobs. They want to vote. They want rights. How are we going to do this? Folks have to figure that out, and it's going to be particularly traumatic to figure that out. So how do you psychologically rebuild this imagined community? And from the perspective of African Americans, what does freedom look like? Right? Lincoln said, okay, you're free. But freedom can't really be given to you. It has to be taken. Right, so he tells these 4 men, okay, you're free. But what we're going to see and what we're going to trace throughout the rest of the semester is, how do African Americans define freedom for themselves? How do they define emancipation? Now it's going to look different. How they define it is really going to be an individual choice. For some freed slaves, freedom meant family. Remember, under the institution of slavery, families were often broken up. You might have a wife sold away, a child sold away. You might get sold south and not know where the rest of your family was. So some folks, when they get the news that they're free, say, what are you going to do? Well, for me, it's about family. I'm going to go find my wife. I'm going to go find my children. Say you're a slave in Georgia. And your wife got sold to Mississippi. Some folks just start walking. Where are you going? I'm going south. I'm going to Mississippi. Why? I have family somewhere there. I'm going to find them. Some people are successful in finding family members. Many are not. For example, there's a famous couple of stories about a husband and wife. Wife gets sold away years earlier. Freedom comes, and the husband says, I'm going to go find my wife. I don't care. I'm going to find my wife. Somehow he's able to track her down and find her. Maybe there's people in the area, maybe you can check newspaper reports, however he finds her. He's very fortunate to find her. Right? But he finds her and she's remarried. She's remarried. Several years later, she's like, I didn't know if you were alive or dead, right? What does he do? He can imagine, like, dang. You know. I mean, she's happy, she's good, he wants the best for her, but what do you do? People going to find children, right? And whatever they needed to do to reconnect families. So this idea of family is going to be particularly important. So for some people, it's labor. Freedom meant the ability to work and get paid. Because remember, we were used to working, right? We knew all about work, but we weren't getting paid. So now it's like, okay, I'm giving you a job. For most freed slaves, the vast majority, their only skill was cotton, working in cotton. So many are going to continue to pick this cotton that makes the country wealthy. Some folks stay on the same plantation. Say, you know what, I'm going to stay right here. At least I know this dude. Now he's got to pay me, though. He's got to pay me now. There's no more free stuff. Pay me. Some leave. Some immediately would leave the plantations that they maybe never left in their lives. Remember, it was illegal to leave the plantation without a pass. Most slaves can't read or write. They couldn't write their own passes. So some, as soon as they hear they're free, okay, let's test this out. I'm out. Some go to North New York. Some come north to Maryland, D.C. All right? But they say, I'm out of here. Mobility means freedom to them. But for some, it's, I need to work. Got to feed my family. There's a funny story about around this idea of working, especially. One enslaved man left his plantation. He says, I'm free, I'm out, I'm going. His plantation, his former owner, realized this guy's a good worker, right? He's like, I need you. I need you to, why don't you stay here and work for me, rather than, staying up there north. You don't know them. They don't love you up there, right? Come back here, I'll treat you right. Right? We'll work out an arrangement, and I'll pay you. It'll be all good. This freed slave man writes him back and says, oh, that sounds like a very generous offer. You're going to pay me, right? I appreciate that. Just one thing. Just one thing. Since I worked for free for you for 20 years, Before I come back and work for you, I'm going to need you to pay that debt. So let's do the math. I work for 20 years, 365 days a year. Let's say, I don't know, $10 an hour. You owe me about $47,000. Just write me a check. You know, once you pay that, I'm good. You good? So he was basically making fun of me. Like, no, you owe me some money. I'm not coming back there. I haven't forgotten. But for some, they said, okay, let's just stay here and work. I think his response is interesting, though. He had some humor with it. He had some math skills. He says, look, you took advantage of me for all these years. Why should I trust you now? But for some African Americans, it was about feeding themselves. For some, it's going to be about education. Remember, it was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. Frederick Douglass talks about this. He says that him learning to read was his first step to freedom. So you can't enslave somebody once they have education, and that's power for him. Not only was it maybe give you the ability to write your own past and escape like it did him, but it's empowering. You know, you're human, right? You're just as equal as anybody else. This theme of education, Booker T. Washington, one of the most prominent African Americans at this time, along with W.B. Du Bois, said that Reconstruction was like a whole race of people going to school at once. People wanted to get educated. They wanted to learn how to read. So you had schoolhouses that suddenly get built. Right? You might have a little child, that 5-year-old child learning how to read in the schoolhouse. Sitting next to them might be their parents who never learned how to read. Sitting next to them might be their parents. So you got a child, parents, grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents, all learning to read in the same room at the same time. Right. Education. What year is Bowie State University founded? look at that. School for Teachers, right? Founded in 1865. A lot, especially HBCUs, are going to be founded in this period of Reconstruction. Right? Not a coincidence. Education meant freedom, power. So how do these folks define freedom? You almost had to ask the individuals. But those are some of the things that we'll continue to look at. Think about that psychology of it. Think about the significance of this. The textbook talks in detail about the kind of politics of Reconstruction. It does a much better job than I can do of laying out a lot of the details. Remember, this is more of an overview. Look at letter C, though. Political transformation. Basically, what I want to do with thinking about the politics of Reconstruction is break it down into two general categories. And the label for these two general categories explains who was in charge of that phase of Reconstruction. So you got presidential Reconstruction, and you have congressional Reconstruction. They're both part of the politics. Presidential, congressional. Who do you think is in charge of presidential Reconstruction? Abraham Lincoln at first, as president. But Lincoln gets shot. Lincoln gets shot in 1865, so he's not in charge for too long. Johnson is going to succeed him. But you're correct. The president is the one that was kind of drawing up the agenda, right? Presidential Reconstruction is about what the president wants in terms of getting this country back together. Now, really, the main thing to remember is presidential Reconstruction. The presidents really wanted to forgive and forget. Move forward. Let's get the country back together as quickly as possible. Don't punish the South too much, right? Let's just get back to business as usual. Right, so presidential Reconstruction is just the main thing to remember. Forgive and forget. Reconciliation is another term. Let's reconcile North and South. Now, congressional Reconstruction, who do you think is in charge of that? Or somebody said? Congress. Congress is going to sort of take over Reconstruction and run it the way they wanted to run it. Now, Congress, especially the radicals in Congress, had a major problem with the way the president was doing things. Congress was like, oh, heck no. Wait a minute. We just got done fighting 4 years of war. 620,000 people are dead. These Confederates, as they would say, left the Union. They fired first at Fort Sumter. Right? Some say they committed treason. Right? What's the punishment for treason? Even today, what's the punishment for treason? Death penalty. Right? Some folks say these folks need the death penalty. But definitely not just a simple kind of forgive and forget. The South needs to be punished, many in Congress are going to say, when they start to take over Reconstruction, right around 1867 or so. So those are the two basic categories I want you to think of: presidential Reconstruction, forgive and forget, or congressional Reconstruction. The South needs to be punished before they're allowed back in to the Union. You'll see some of the details there, some examples to support that. Lincoln and Johnson, they're about reconciliation. Lincoln actually hoped for black immigration. So Lincoln hoped black people could leave the country. He didn't necessarily think we could be a country, black and white, kind of together, all people equal. He thought it'd be best if we could kind of sail away somewhere, right? But he does do certain things, put certain things in place to begin to help African Americans. And African Americans are going to love Lincoln for this. Right? African Americans, if you went into an African American home in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you saw a picture of Jesus on the wall, a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the wall, and then later a picture of Booker T. Washington, and later a picture of Martin Luther King. Lincoln was beloved as a hero. African Americans loved the Republican Party because Lincoln was Republican. He was the first Republican to win presidential election. At that point, early on, African Americans were largely Republican in their political allegiance. That's flipped, right? Now, 90+% of African Americans tend to vote Democratic. But in this period, and really all the way up to the 1930s, African Americans tended to vote Republican because the Republican Party was seen as the party of Lincoln. The Republican Party was the one that was carrying out Reconstruction. So it's interesting to think about how things have flipped and some of the reasons why. Actually, in this case, in this moment, the Democratic Party was really a Southern party and a very white racist party. And they were kind of outright with it. They had, all kind of cartoons and stuff of, black rapists running around, and this is what's going to happen if you vote Republican. They were pretty blatant with their racism. Abraham Lincoln didn't even run on the Southern ballot. He was like, there's no point even running in the South. That's how divided the country was, politically and racially. He still wins, but he didn't even run in the South. This is one of the reasons why the Confederacy says we're leaving. So that change is going to be dramatic. You have presidential Reconstruction, trying to forgive and forget. Johnson actually vetoes the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about what the 14th Amendment was in a second. But the radicals in Congress take over, the radical Republicans take over, and they're going to do certain things to punish the South. As it says here, the South is occupied by the Union Army. There are federal troops in the South occupying the defeated Confederacy, making sure they do certain things, making sure they follow this plan of Reconstruction, at least at first. Like I said, until 1877, there are troops there. The South is divided up into 5 districts, 5 military districts, and you had a Union general in charge of these military districts, kind of making the South do things that maybe they didn't want to do at first. All Southern states are forced to drop new state constitutions. They're forced to ratify the 14th Amendment before they'll be let back in to the Union. Why do the Republicans do this? Were all Republicans great people? No, not necessarily. Were all of them in favor of racial equality? No, not necessarily. They think, look, these are 4 million new voters that are going to vote Republican. So we can do certain things, keep that in place. We can vote out the Democrats. For some, it was just about politics. There are some Republicans that were just, were truly in favor of equality, but that's really going to be a small number. It's really going to be a small number. For many, it was just about politics. They think that these new black voters could weaken the Democratic Party. Congress would override Andrew Johnson's veto of the 14th Amendment. What are these amendments? There's something called the Civil War Amendments. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Anybody know what the 13th Amendment did? It was passed in 1865. What does the 13th Amendment do? Take a guess. The first one of the 3. Enslave, frees the slaves. Exactly. And the war ends in 1865, and this 13th Amendment is going to be passed. But it's significant. There are a couple of interesting things about it. This basically says you cannot enslave someone because of race. Yet there is a loophole in this 13th Amendment that remains significant to this day. If you read it, it says you cannot enslave someone in involuntary servitude except as a result of a crime. except as a result of a crime. So some folks have said that was kind of the beginning of what we call the prison industrial complex, right? Having prisoners work for free or for very cheap, doing things like building desks for colleges and making 2 cents an hour, right? Some folks say that's where that starts. Chain gangs. They convict you of a crime, and maybe you have to work and dig ditches. We'll talk more about that later on. But the 13th Amendment is obviously an important tipping point. It officially ends racial slavery in this country. 1865 for that. 14th Amendment passes in 1868. You got the dates there on the outline. What do you think the 14th Amendment does? Not quite yet. It's a good guess, though. Not voting yet. Before we get to voting, 15th actually going to have to do with voting. It's related, though. It's essentially due process or citizenship rights. Right? You're not supposed to be able to deprive someone of citizenship rights based on race. So you can go to court and testify these types of things. You're supposed to be able to go to court and testify these sorts of things. 15th Amendment, like you said, passes in 1870. What do you think that does? Has to do with voting, she said. Good point. Voting for men. Specifically, what it says is you cannot deprive someone the right to vote based on their race. Doesn't say anything about gender. All right, so black men are supposed to have the right to vote as of 1870. Black women don't get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. In fact, white women didn't have it either. Women don't get the right to vote for another 50 years. 19th Amendment. All right, so we talk about how race and gender are significant. This is a good example of that. In fact, there are a number of feminists, white and black feminists, that were in support of the amendment, and they find out that it's not going to empower women too. So some feminists would step away and say, nah, we're not voting for that, because it doesn't help us. There's a major split that happens between the abolitionist movement and the feminist movement around this issue. Because some say, well, black men get the right to vote, and we'll help you get yours. Some people are like, nah, we need to get it all now. It's really significant in that sense. Letter D, all that's important with that is migration. It's about movement of people. We've kind of already talked about that. Some people leaving plantations, going from north to south, going looking for family members. You also have immigrants coming from other countries in large numbers again after the war, especially Irish and German immigrants. Chinese immigrants coming to the West as some of the first Asian Americans. Letter E is significant. We'll sort of begin to wrap up here. It says the politics of fear. The politics of fear in the post-slavery era. I told you I wanted you to think about the psychology here. The psychology for African Americans that are trying to figure out what their place in society is going to be now. But also the politics of white, or the fear for whites, the psychology for whites, that now have to make sense of what is this country going to look like. If you're a white Southerner and all of a sudden 4 million people that were slaves yesterday, that were property yesterday, that were not considered human, are told, okay, you're good, ready to go. What is this going to look like? Say you're a plantation owner, you had 300 slaves yesterday. First of all, now you're broke. Right? You were a millionaire before in terms of how much that property was worth. All of a sudden you're broke. You woke up broke. Plus, you might think that people might be a little upset. You know, JoJo, the slave, might have been like, hey, last Tuesday you with me. You want to come outside for a minute so we can talk about that? A lot of folks are afraid that there's going to be major violence, black people are going to kill up folks, that whites will be enslaved. Doesn't happen. Right? Freed slaves tend to be very forgiving. Some of them said some stuff, told me to kiss their butt and that kind of stuff. But you didn't get a whole bunch of folks killing folks. You didn't get that happening. But there's tremendous fear that this might happen. There's fear that now these 4 million folks are going to get the right to vote and vote black folks in and re-enslave whites. Right, so there's tremendous fear in this period. Tremendous fear. Some people say there's going to be a period of black domination in Reconstruction. Some folks call it black Reconstruction, in fact. And you thought you saw some evidence that politically black people might dominate. Especially take a state like South Carolina. South Carolina had a black majority population in many parts of the state for a long time, going back to its founding. You might have 65% black people in some of the major cities. What happens if they all start voting? They don't elect who they want to elect, right? They might hold a grudge. You start to see some of this. Look at this statistic here. In 1870, South Carolina's legislature has 87 blacks and only 40 whites. Imagine that. Say, okay, put yourself in this position. I know it's a stretch. You are a white slaveholder from South Carolina in 1864. Got 300 slaves on your plantation. You're doing well. Then you got a rice plantation. South Carolina was big for rice. All of a sudden, the next year, not only are your 300 slaves free and you're broke, but JoJo, who you beat last week, is now elected to the House of Representatives in the state of South Carolina. Maybe he's the governor. JoJo comes back around to the plantation like, hey, remember me? I'm your governor. Oh, all right. That's tremendous fear. Any normal person would be tremendously afraid if you have mistreated people for generations and all of a sudden they're gaining political power. So what's going to be the response to this? We're going to see a number of responses to this. It's not a surprise that in 1867, an organization called the Ku Klux Klan would be founded in Tennessee. Right, to try to intimidate people, keep them from voting, keep them on the plantations, keep them disempowered. So think about this fear and think about the responses of this fear. Right, so there's a fear, a feeling that blacks need to be controlled, put in their place. You hear that often, right? Two major motivations, as we'll see. Fear is always a motivator. People do things because they're afraid. And they do things for money, economics. Two major motivators. I'm going to give you two terms. I know you thought this was just history class, but we're going to do a little Latin today. De jure. De jure. It's on here. D-E-J-U-R-E. It's a Latin term. Basically means in law. Like official, basically, in law. So we're going to talk about two different types of racism. You have de jure racism, something that's written down in law. Right? So as we'll talk about having black and white drinking fountains or not being able to vote. If it's written down in law, it's official, that's a de jure. That's de jure racism or de jure right. The 15th Amendment, it's a de jure right. It says you have the right to vote. You can go down to the courthouse and read it. A black man can vote. That's de jure. De facto, on the other hand, is sort of common practice, unofficial. So you have unofficial rights or unofficial activities, unofficial racism, and you have official. So a de jure example of de jure racism might be the Ku Klux Klan. Give you an example. 1870, black men have the right to vote, right? Yeah, there's some black men hanging out. They're like, you know what? Next week is the election. I'm going to go down there and vote. I can't wait. It's going to be the first time I ever got to vote. Can't wait. Friday night, go to sleep. I can't wait. I'm going to set my alarm. I'm going to get up early so I can go vote tomorrow. Saturday morning, I'm going to vote. Might be talking loud. You know how we do. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. Like, what's going on? You go open the door. It's about 20 men with hoods on, with shotguns, torches. And they're like, yeah, we heard, JoJo, we heard you're talking about voting tomorrow. Oh, yeah. It's 15th Amendment passed. I'm going to go down there to the courthouse. I'm going to vote. I'm going to go ahead and do it tomorrow. Yeah, you might not want to do that, JoJo. No, I have to. You didn't get the memo? They said I could vote. It's my de jure right. If you go down there and vote, I think you might have an accident on the way down. So you have the de jure right, but there are going to be all kinds of mechanisms put in place to keep people from voting. Because wait a second, think about it. 1870, you got the right to vote. I just saw that movie Selma last week. They were marching in 1965. That's 100 years later. Why are people still marching for the right to vote 100 years later? Because you couldn't exercise those rights, right? There are going to be a number of things put in place to slowly take away the rights that people got officially during Reconstruction. Civil rights movement is often called the second Reconstruction because the job wasn't complete. Right? The job wasn't complete. So keep those two terms in mind. We'll talk about some more examples of that. De jure, de facto. Right? De jure and de facto. You know what those? You understand the difference between those two? It'll become more clear when we look at some more examples of it. Here there are some de jure and de facto white supremacy, right? Increasingly hostile environment leads to the passage of black codes. Passage of black codes. Black codes were local laws that only applied to African Americans. Vagrancy laws, for example, a vagrancy law, you see signs that no vagrants. You basically couldn't just be hanging out. If you're hanging out in front of 7-Eleven, right, it says no vagrancy, they can arrest you. You can't just hang out there. In this point, if you got arrested for vagrancy, they would take you down to the jail, but then they'd put you on a chain gang, or they'd hire you out to one of these plantation owners that no longer had any slaves, but they had some cotton they needed picking. So think about that 13th Amendment. Well, it was a way of re-enslaving people legally. Vagrancy laws. Property laws. It said laws that you couldn't own property if you were African American. Now, if you're a farmer and you can't own land, how are you going to feed your family? You can't. You have to be a sharecropper or do something else. Curfew. Got to be in the dark if you're African American. No, can't have guns. Disfranchisement. Laws about disfranchisement. The word franchise means vote. Vote. So disfranchisement were various laws that get put in place to take away the right to vote. We'll talk more about those next time. Blacks not allowed to testify in court against whites. Despite the fact that the 14th Amendment says you could, you get these local laws that said you could not. Last example here, intimidation, violence. We talked about South Carolina 1870. In 1871, black government officials in South Carolina are given 15 days to resign. So you got elected to the House of Representatives, but the plan shows up like, hey, you might not want to be here in 2 weeks. You might want to be gone. And folks are literally kicked out. So you're seeing how this Reconstruction process is giving people a bunch of rights, but how these rights are already being slowly taken away. We'll finish talking about this next time. If you have not finished